The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Bernard Wolfsdorf. I'm firstly going to apologize for our slight delay in starting. We will continue the program until 2 o'clock, so we will get our full money's worth. We had a slight technical snafu with one of our speakers, but we welcome you all today to our four-part EB-5 investor webinar series. Our next webinar will be in 2 weeks on December the 13th, and we have 3 of the top experts joining and participating in our four-part program. First, we have Mr. Brian Su, Chief Executive Officer of the Artisan Business Group, and as mentioned, when it comes to marketing and understanding the EB-5 program, Brian is the name that stands out in the field, an absolute expert in this area. Brian also hosts the EB-5 Summit and Exposition in Shanghai. Next year, March 15th to March 18th will be the 3rd program, and I had the privilege of attending the last summit in Shanghai in March 2012, and all I can say, folks, quite frankly, is wow, it was amazing. Absolutely everybody was there, all the main regional centers, migration agents, and of course, most important, the actual investors themselves. We also have today with us Mr. Michael Gibson, Managing Director of usadvisors.org. If you are interested in the EB-5...
I tried everything. Tell him.
If you are... Whoops, that's our little technical snafu there, folks, and somebody came on live. We also have Michael Gibson, Managing Director of usadvisors.org. If you are interested and wish to understand the concept of due diligence, Michael Gibson is the leading expert in this arena, and I encourage you all to take a look at his website, usadvisors.org, as listed on our screen. Well, our screen keeps hopping around, but such is technology. It may have a life of its own. I will continue with my introduction. And last but not least is Jor Law, our business and securities attorney. Let me just say he's absolutely top-notch in this particular field, and extremely, extremely well respected in this arena. So thank you again, folks, and I'm again.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Is that Mr. Brian Su?
Yes, I'm so sorry.
Don't be sorry, Brian. You're live, and everybody can hear you, and I'm sure it's not you, it's me, and we're delighted. Brian, I just briefly made the introduction, and I am hopeful that just testing everybody here, the slides, I just want to advance the slides here.
Okay.
And there we are. This is Mr. Brian Su, everybody, the absolute leading specialist when it comes to marketing. I've introduced your areas of specialty, Brian. We have some slides there, the Artisan Business Group. For those of you who have not logged on, that's www.eb5newsblog.org. As I mentioned, Brian is the absolute leader in this area. And when it comes to EB-5 capital raising funds, Brian is the go-to person. Now, Brian, I know you've just come back from China, and I wonder if you could please take the mic and explain the EB-5 market. What happened out there? What's going on in the EB-5 arena?
Okay. Yeah, I just came back from China last week. The good news is, the Chinese are continuing to trying to find good projects. Okay, so the interest is very strong. As everybody know, China is the largest EB-5 market. 80% investors are coming from China. So based on our trade mission, we met with Chinese immigration brokers, law firms, accounting firms, investors, it seems that everyone is interested in EB-5.
Well, thank you, Brian. And just so everybody is aware, the critical element of this particular program is the ability to link the regional centers with the attorneys, with the due diligence folks like Michael Gibson, together with, of course, most importantly, the market. And Brian is the absolute key link when it comes to tying all these various groups together. As Brian mentioned, approximately 80% of current investors are coming from China and Taiwan. Korea, I think, is in number 2, but we certainly have seen a major pickup in business coming from Mexico, Venezuela, other parts of Latin America, and of course the Middle East. As a result of this, as Brian's slide indicates, this year alone, that is through till September 30th, over 6,526 processed. With those kind of numbers, anticipating as many as 2.1, 2.5 average visa usage per petition, we can anticipate that the 10,000 annual limit will finally be reached this year. Brian, a question to you, sir. Has this created any anxiety in the Chinese market that possibly there will be a backlog developing in the EB-5 arena?
Absolutely, because of the concern that there would be restrictions for the investor from China. So the Chinese investors really want, get onto the program.
So there's a lot of excitement to get in right now because people understand that a waiting line may in fact develop, in fact almost certainly will develop as early as the second quarter of next year. Our office just blogged on this point, and Brian posted that on his blog website. So if you want to learn more about that particular issue and the consequences of what we call a visa backlog, and is commonly known as retrogression in the trade. Moving on, Brian, I wonder if you can give us an update on the Chinese market. What's going on? What is the reality out there in the field today?
Okay, most of the Chinese investors are coming from the major metropolitan areas, such as Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou. But I always advise my clients, not to ignore the second-tier markets. There are a lot of mid-sized and small-sized cities. So definitely, when you want to market projects, you want to explore the second-tier or even third-tier marketplace in China. And you want to work with the Chinese immigration agencies, which are licensed, the only entity that can legally and openly promote EB-5 programs.
Very good. And, I was mentioning you are the host of the EB-5 Summit and Expo, which will be held on March 15th to March 18th in Shanghai, which I had the privilege of attending, and it was really, really exciting. But at that program, people from all over China were coming. I remember meeting people from Beijing. Everybody was flying in. So by attending that particular seminar, you would be able to access the regional centers, the clients, the brokers. Basically, everybody comes to the summit. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, next year's event will be much bigger because we are working with the largest real estate show in Shanghai together under one roof at the same time. So that real estate show typically attracts 120,000 people in 4 days.
Wow, so those numbers are staggering, Brian. 120,000 people. You've got up here on your slide the number of Chinese millionaires increasing every year. I was just staggered with the amount of wealth that was in China and the number of people who want to get out of China and have what I would call an insurance policy. But even putting that one aside, the number of Chinese folks who want to educate their children in the United States. Brian, approximately how many millionaires, how many people with a net worth over 10 million do we have in China?
Yeah, based on the recent data, there are over 200 billionaires and over 1 million millionaires.
Wow. Wow. Those are crazy numbers. And, you know, China still is a communist country, so I think a lot of people want some level of security because they're not quite sure what the future would bring. Obviously, the Chinese economy has slowed from 11 to 7 or 8%, but it's still booming and huge wealth creation, and that's really what's driving this EB-5, this massive increase in the EB-5 program. Is that more or less correct?
Yes, you know, China just changed their leadership this month. So a new group of leadership is in place. That makes a lot of people concerned what direction China will go in next 10 years.
Well, I'm an optimist, and I think they're going to continue to be as smart as they've been in the last 10 years to develop, quite frankly, what seems to be a more capitalist country sometimes than many others that I'm aware of. Now, Brian, you're very, very interestingly here, you refer to approximately 20 EB-5 regional centers that are active. There's over 225 currently registered. Only 10% of them are active. And you've also made a very interesting point that the direct, or the word that I use at least for this is now the standalone EB-5 projects, which is different from the regional center projects. That's where a direct or standalone project is a situation where one individual will invest $1 million or $500,000, as the case may be, and hire 10 employees and be able to get a project not going through a regional center. So you're seeing a lot of increase in the standalone projects, Brian?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, Burger King franchise, McDonald's, 7-Eleven, and other type of service sectors are entering into the EB-5 program, and they are marketed in China.
Oh my gosh! Now the big food chains are coming in and seeing this as an excellent way. It's very, very interesting because several years ago, Southland Corp 7-Eleven, to my knowledge, was involved in the predecessor, which is the e-visa program, which allowed people to get a work visa based on a $250,000 investment. So the new hot area of development, we've seen hotels get into this regional center development, but now we're seeing the franchisors actually diving in and seeing the market, the EB-5 market, as an excellent way to raise funds and have folks come in and directly supervise their own investment. So give me an update, Brian, if you will, on the current market condition. You've listed 4 or 5 interesting projects up here. Tell me a little bit about these.
Okay, those are the latest projects, and those are the large projects I mentioned. Okay, there are about a dozen smaller projects I did not include in this slides. Okay, the first one is the Las Vegas Hotel Casino. It's very big, looking for 230 investors, and they are my clients. And they started the project end of July in China. It should be sold out by the end of December.
Wow. Wow.
And the second project is a former Lady Luck Casino, now changed to the new name, Downtown Third. That's another project entered the China last month. And also it's a big project. The Seattle Stadium Place, it's a high-rise mixed-use property. It's a condo project. That's also my clients. And they have been starting the seminar last month, and it's selling very well. Okay. The number 4 project, Cambridge Lee, that's a Can-Am's project. It's a manufacturing project. So it's a little bit different. And the investor really wants something different. So the project attracts a very good amount of investors. Yeah, the last one is a huge project as well. in Washington, D.C. area. They are looking for $100 million EB-5 money. All the dollars I mentioned, they are all EB-5 monies.
Well, Brian, you know, I'm not very good at math, but if I roughly add this up, we got $500 million. That is $500 million capital raise. And I can honestly tell you, I've only studied project number 1. I have reviewed the documents on the SLS project. Some of my clients have gone with that. And quite frankly, it seems to be very well put together. Some of the pressing issues relating to, for example, tenant occupancy issues seem to have been very, very well addressed. I know in that project, JP Morgan is coming up with $300 million as the primary initial investor, and this $115 million raise follows behind it. So what we're seeing here are these two Las Vegas projects, 1 and 2, very major projects with huge capital raises, and apparently most of these going very, very well. So certainly interesting to see the major development and huge growth both in the size of the projects and the scope of the project. So Brian, give us a few tips here. How does this work? What is the key to success? So you know, I've set up my regional center and I've got my project, but I really don't know how to get out there. Give us some basic tips on what the key to success is when getting out into the market.
I think the key is the developers really have to have a very good start by working with the right people, you know, such as security lawyers, immigration lawyers, you know, all the EB-5 consultants and professionals. Make sure the offering is done correctly in the very beginning. Also, they have to learn the lessons from their competitors, from the past projects, so that they can develop a winning strategy, okay, for the Chinese market or for the other markets. And they have to be very flexible as well.
Brian, your words of wisdom are, I know you've been around pretty much from the beginning with regard to the surge that we saw coming in the last few years, and it's almost crazy out there, the buzz in the EB-5 arena. Everybody's diving in. My office gets 5 or 6 calls a day from people who want to dive into the program as well as clients. So it's the Wild West out there, and there's a lot of what I would call newbies coming in. There's a lot of experienced people, and yet there's also a word of caution, because there are many, many dangers and pitfalls that we will address within the framework of the EB-5 program. And if you need to contact Mr. Brian Su, there's his contact information. He is quite frankly one of the absolute specialists in this. It is an honor to have you participate today, Brian, and share your words with wisdom. We are going to have 3 more of these and webinars. The next one's in 2 weeks on December the 13th. So what Brian's explained is how the program basically works, what the latest good news is, and we're now moving into our second speaker. For those of you who have questions, I believe you will be able to type your questions into us, and hopefully Brian will be able to stay with us. So now we've got to the point where we have these various projects, we understand how it works, and the next critical element is called due diligence. So the person to go to, quite frankly, in my experience, is Mr. Brian Gibson. Brian, are you there, and can you hear me?
Yeah, Michael Gibson, Bernie.
My brain's gone. And didn't I do this last time we shared a panel where
yes.
I mixed up your first name? It's got something to do with early onset. Sorry, I'll stop that bad joke. I inherited this from my mom. So, Michael, I apologize for the name, but Michael Gibson, the absolute expert when it comes to, I've only done about 5 panels with him. I should know his name by now. Absolute expert when it comes to doing wow, that's a tongue twister, doing due diligence on EB-5 projects. So Michael, Brian outlined 4 or 5 projects. You're the guy that kicks the tires, evaluates these projects, and please give us your words of wisdom either on any of these projects or on generally how you approach this issue.
Sure. Thanks so much, Bernie. Well, I think first of all, these comments are going to be addressed primarily to the practitioners out there. So I think a lot of what Brian was bringing up, how to raise capital in China, very important for the issuers, for the developers. These comments, which I'm going to make, are directed to the attorneys who will be listening to the call, who may be looking to give advice to their clients. And let me preface that before by saying that my background for almost 20 years was with Citibank, where we were having to manage our risk and our exposure in different markets around the world. And what I see predominantly in this field or in this industry is, by and large, a huge number of immigration attorneys giving advice to their clients on which projects to select. So Brian just mentioned a handful. There's probably in the market right now maybe 2 or 3 dozen. So there's a whole host of other ones. And I guess the question for the practitioner, Bernie, for you and for your brethren, your colleagues, when your foreign investors come into your office or when they contact you, the first question they're going to ask is, beyond whether what immigration option, once you've discussed all the options and you settle on the EB-5 permanent residency, then the next question is going to be, which project do they select?
Without a doubt, and I get that question all the time. And what I do is I tell them, look, I can advise you on immigration risk. I can advise you on issues like the job count, tenant occupancy, bridge financing, etc., and look for what I'm going to call structural things. But when it comes to giving financial advice, I can't do that. I'm not authorized to do that. That's when I say, hey, call Michael Gibson. Is that the correct way to approach these, Michael?
Well, that's a minority, and what I think is misunderstood in the market right now, and this is somewhat being promoted by the developers and some of the attorneys that they work with, and even I've been to several of the immigration, you and I have spoken on half a dozen panels, and some of those have been in immigration conferences, immigration law conferences, and I have heard other immigration attorneys say, yes, we don't give advice, but at the same, and then in the very next sentence, but they say these are the 6 things that we look at to give guidance on which projects we think or which regional centers we put our clients in touch with or invest in. And I think this is the issue that is facing the immigration community, in that on one hand they say, yes, we don't give financial or investment advice, and then on the very next sentence they actually do that. And what I've heard frequently when I ask these same attorneys, how do you do that? How do you say to them, to your clients, we're not going to give you investment advice, and then on the very next sentence they're showing them a list of 5 or 6 regional centers which they quote unquote say have good track records or use other terminology on which to send them. And what I'm trying to explain to the immigration attorneys out there is that if they are going to give advice, and remember, I think one of the earlier slides, it showed the difference between information and advice. Giving information is fine. Which centers have I-526 approvals, which have I-29 approvals, and then giving advice, which is a completely different thing, because if you give somebody advice and then they rely on your statements and make an investment decision, and that decision turns out to be a bad one, for instance, a project. And remember, unlike traditional private equity investments, where you really only have 2 outcomes, you have either the project increases in value or it decreases. With EB-5 investments, you actually have 4 possible outcomes, and 3 of those are negative. So I think for the practitioner who is looking, what do I do? What we say, and we look at the securities regulations and the securities law, we look to say that the less information that you give your clients that they will rely on to make a decision is probably going to put you in the safest harbor.
We fully get that. So thank you for that warning, Michael. I know you have, quite frankly, given very good advice, instilled considerable fear through the bar but it's appropriate here, and thank you for those. Talk to us a little bit about why projects fail. What are the big problems that you're seeing? There have been a few projects that have these are not always well publicized, but there have been a few projects which have resulted in denial of the 526, and at that point things start to get ugly. So what are the main reasons why projects fail, Michael?
Right, and again, remember, we're in dealing with EB-5. EB-5 is simply a private equity investment with a visa attached to that. So when we look at the EB-5 investments, they are far more complicated than doing simple private equity investments, which on their own are complicated enough. So we realize, or we recognize, that there's essentially two components which have to be realized for a successful outcome, and the first obviously is the job creation. So the most important thing in all of these investor applications is that they have the removal of conditions. Without that, there is absolutely no point in doing this investment. So investors will forego return and a lot of other things, but they cannot lose sight of obtaining the unconditional removal of the conditions. So we have to be very specific with how are these projects going to create jobs, and I think the outstanding issue beyond tenant occupancy is, will the project actually create sufficient economic activity to support the huge number of claims? And I'll give you a specific example. A project just last month that was fully funded with EB-5 investors claiming to create thousands of jobs was not, went lights out, went dark because they were not able to raise the other portion of the capital that was non-EB-5. And so in that case, you have it was a manufacturing facility that is essentially dark, and all of those investors will lose their petition for residency. So on the one hand, you have to look at what is the complete capital raise. Are they able to do it? Do they have a track record? I think the problem that we're seeing right now is the project sizes seem to be getting larger and larger, and that entails additional risk. So we want to look at how much capital is being raised, what is the component of EB-5, and then do the people who are doing this raise, have they successfully done that in the past?
That is so important to emphasize. I'd always heard this line, if a project is too small or too big, but I think too big can also be a challenge. If they only can raise 70 or 80% of the revenue, then we have a problem with, well, what happens with the deficiency? And the other point that you mentioned in passing, Michael, which I think is just so important, is everybody thinks of this as an investor program, but the reality is equally important, and sometimes more important, is that it's a job creation program. And making sure that the job counts is, number one, realistic, and then remember, this is a two-step process. So we get to the filing of the 829 taking place 2.5, 3 years later to make sure that the jobs are actually created. So that becomes a sort of a judgment day further down the road, and there's nothing worse than having the 829 denied, at which point the foreign national actually gets put into removal proceedings, deportation, the other ugly word, and presumably at that point we're going to see lawsuits and everything ugly starting to occur. So having a proper financial specialist, a well-trained expert, kick the tires, evaluate the investment, taking into account not only immigration risk but also financial risk to make sure that the full raise will in fact occur is obviously critical, and as the market gets more flooded, this of course will become more difficult. Can you explain some of these concepts like fair value and the type of things that you engage in, some of the other problems such as guarantees, that word that we hear that we're not allowed to use?
Right. I think the concept of fair value is the most important one, and the one that we focus on when we are doing our evaluations. It may be unfamiliar to immigration attorneys, but it's the one that bankers use in investment firms when they are evaluating whether to make an investment. And the key to understanding what this is if you take, and this is going to be a problem for a very large number of investments which are currently being funded in the market today. And what we do is we will look at what is the total estimated use of funds, how much are they going to raise, and then what is the value of that asset going to be at completion. And the key question here is, and I'll tell you, there's a very well-known EB-5 project which has been being marketed for years and years. What we do is we know that they've invested about $300 million to build this facility, and then when we do a fair market valuation, we find out that the actual market value is about $50 million. So the question is, about $250 million in capital, where did it go? It just simply disappeared. Well, what happened is you had people who built a dinosaur that has no market value or very little, and all of these investors, when they go to exit, the developer will be unable to repay their principal. So the question is, for any of these investments, whether they're the casino or the mixed use or retail or shopping centers or whatever they happen to be, is how much capital will it cost to develop the asset, and then what is the expected future market value for that. And I think this is the problem, is that, and this is in every single EB-5 project that we've seen, the developer promotion and the promises being made by the developer significantly outstrip the actual market reality. And we see this in a lot of the commercial real estate development, where the developer is coming in and saying, well, yes, it's going to be $50 million to build this asset, and the market value at completion or at term should be $150 million. When we look at assets in that market, very similar assets to that, comparables, and we see a fraction of that being currently valued in the market. So I think the ability to kind of take the developers' pro formas and put that to the market test, the actual market test, is the piece that's missing for most of the investors.
So what I'm really hearing here is that while there may be many experts who can do a financial analysis of a project, many of them are not actually familiar with the critical immigration ingredients. And if you're going to do a financial analysis of a project, you have to do it not only from an investment perspective in terms of what's going to work, which would be standard across the industry, but also making sure that you meet the immigration requirements such as job counts, etc.
That's exactly true, and that's the reason why the other thing we hear a lot of is when immigration attorneys say, oh yeah, we've done a risk assessment or a risk evaluation or a due diligence, and I said, who did you hire? And they'll say, oh, we hired a CPA. And I said, well, what did they do? Because remember, 90% of these offerings are new commercial enterprises, so there's no actual financial track record. There's no operating statement, no income statement, no balance sheets. So while we can look at the developer and their track record to see how do they stack up with doing other developments, a CPA or even a financial auditor typically won't be able to evaluate certainly the employment impact analysis. You need an economist for that. And also to do what we use is we use more mathematicians to do probability analysis, because there is data on the success of building shopping centers and casinos, but it's not going to be historical data. You have to really use current market valuations and do projections into the future as to what their value may be.
Wow, this is a whole lot more sophisticated. So the type of analysis that needs to be done is really very, very sophisticated. It's not your regular old business analyst who's going to look at a project and be able to provide the kind of sophisticated advice when it comes to risk management and mitigation. You know, Michael, every time I look at your slides and I go through them, I suddenly realize exactly how complicated and how sophisticated this particular area is. There we have, I hope it's all clear, everybody, Michael's EB-5 due diligence checklist, which quite frankly is the best I've ever seen. I've been able to use it from time to time and encourage my clients to use it. There's also Michael's contact information, www.eb5info.com. He is, as I say, the most experienced expert when it comes to providing financial advice on specific projects. And here's the second page of his due diligence checklist. Really, this is really called kicking the tires and checking out every single aspect of the project. So we're very fortunate to have Michael Gibson join us. We've just had two of the leading specialists in this arena, Mr. Brian Sue, when it comes to marketing and distributing and connecting all the different parts from the regional centers to the projects. He led off. We followed that with Mr. Michael Gibson, who's the absolute expert. Again, I'm going to put in my regular proviso. This is not legal advice that we're providing today. We're just providing general information. If you do want legal advice, you need to follow up specifically with an attorney, but we're going to give you some general advice on how to follow. Did that the qualifier help at all, Michael? Sorry, I'm just making the standard joke. The lawyers go ahead and give advice, and then they say that wasn't advice. You have to be very, very careful in terms of how you do this, and I hope I haven't been making that mistake myself. But thank you, Michael. And I know some of your statements haven't been very popular with the immigration bar, because you're standing up there and telling the truth and warning us. And I, for one, am very grateful for the caution that has been shared, because Michael, there's rumors the SEC is circling and hovering and looking at some projects and nosing around with some of the practices that have gone on. Can you comment on that, Michael?
Absolutely. We were contacted by FINRA. We're regulated by FINRA, so FINRA is usually the first step in trying to determine if there's been malfeasance or fraud or misrepresentation, and we actually complained to USCIS that there were firms in the United States that were making promises to investors which were not true, and so we made a complaint. They responded, and we know that based on our call with them that there is not only the SEC but the Department of Justice and the FBI is involved. So the point is, I think up until now it's been kind of a free ride for a lot of people in the industry. They've basically said and done whatever they want, and they've gotten away with it. But where we don't even, and I know Jor will probably comment on this, we don't think actually enforcement action by the regulatory authorities is going to be what's going to change the practice in the industry. We think it's going to be litigation. And already we see some investor lawsuits that have come against not only the issuers but their attorneys, their immigration attorneys, for having made recommendations into these projects. And I think that trend is going to continue as we see more projects fail, more 829s get denied. And so I guess the word of caution to the people who are on the call is that the things that were done in the past may not be the way you want to go forward in your practice. You may want to consider using some best practices in informing your clients on what they should do, because the rules of the game are going to change pretty soon.
Michael, there's no question that due diligence is the name of the game, and even if we look at the numbers, we were seeing denial rates of, we had 79, 80% approval rates on the 829, but simple bottom line is that also means 1 in 5 is being denied. And at that point, once litigation commences, quite frankly, everybody gets sued. The lawyers get sued. So I take your words of caution very, very seriously, and I thank you for the guidance that you've given us. We really appreciate that. Now, moving into our next arena, is our corporate and securities attorney. So before we get into trouble, number one, we are very cautious to follow Michael Gibson's guidance and counsel and not dive into the financial analysis arena when we're not qualified to do so, number one. And number two, so when we start in this arena, EB-5, whether we're setting up a regional center, whether we are drafting critical documents, we do need to hire a corporate and securities attorney. The corporate and securities attorney, who is one of the most experienced players in this arena, is Michael. Let me try and not get names mixed up. Let's try one more time. Is Mr. Jor Law, who is very, very knowledgeable in this. And there, of course, is Jor's disclaimer So Jor is very cautious to put in his disclaimer, a true securities attorney. And one of the things that we deal with, Jor, in terms of setting up an EB-5 regional center is this critical element of, do we go with an equity investment or a loan investment? I'm just putting this up because it's your first slide, but Jor, take it away. What do you do in this particular EB-5 arena?
Yeah, you know, when getting to EB-5, it's good to understand that predominantly there's two models in a marketplace. There's what's commonly called the equity model, which you'll see on your screen is on the left-hand side. And then there's what's commonly called the loan model, which you see is on the right-hand side. In reality, the loan model is first an equity infusion by the investor, and then afterward a loan from the capital raising entity into the project company. Now, there are variations on both of these structures, but by far and large, these are the most basic structures and most commonly used structures. So in essence, the equity model and the loan model start off with the same basic structure, whereby the investor invests in a special purpose vehicle, and that's typically a LLC or a limited partnership. We find that in the East Coast, because of some of the practitioners there, some more LLCs have been used. On the West Coast, the LPs have generally been used. As a matter of general reference, you know, our firm is generally more comfortable with a limited partnership because USCIS is known for changing their minds, and the limited partnership structure is specifically written into the regulations, whereas the limited liability company structure is not. So, you know, this is a webinar.
Just being rude and butting in, that's because the EB-5 has a requirement that the investor has to actually be involved in the management of the enterprise, whereas the Limited Partnership Act to some degree can restrict the involvement, whereas the LLC does not have that particular provision. So there's more cover or protection, as it were, when you're working within the framework of the limited partnership as your primary vehicle. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's mainly to get away from the management and policy-making rights that you would have to give to investors. It wouldn't make sense for you to have 40 investors all having a say in your business.
And George, just to throw a question at you, we're talking about the equity model and the loan model. The loan model really is kind of taken over today. Of those 5 projects, and you may not be familiar with all of them, aren't they pretty much all loan model, or some of those equity as well?
Yeah, that's right. You know, some of those may end up being equity. We represent a good number of those deals on one side or another. But I think the statistics are something like over 90% of the deals are in the EB-5 marketplace are loan models.
And is that because of the perception that with a loan model you've got a better chance of getting your money back after the green card has been issued, after the conditions have been removed?
I think that's the perception. Unfortunately, I think our firm might have had something to do with this. Back when we first got involved, one of our very early deals, there was a reason for corporate reasons that the borrower, that our client couldn't take equity and had to do it as a loan. Their equity players basically just wouldn't, you know, dilute their equity. And at that moment, we were talking to the foreign agents, and they insisted on equity because that's what they were used to. And it took us about 6 to 8 months to explain to them and for them to finally understand how U.S. laws treat debt as opposed to equity, and how debt is actually safer than equity. Ever since that deal, and I don't know if we were responsible for it or not, ever since that deal, it seemed that the market, you know, magically changed overnight to want loan deals. I think in the future you'll start seeing more equity deals again as the industry matures, but right now it's dominated by the loan model.
Very good. So when we go forward and we set up our regional center, and there's numerous types of documents that are required, this is the role that you, in fact, become involved in. Can you run through some of the more common EB-5 documents that are used and seen in this arena?
Yeah, I mean, you know, before we do this, the slide is up. You'll be able to look through it. So I'll comment it rather than just read out the slide. Typically, you're going to have a set of securities offering documents, which we'll get into in the next slide. But outside of the securities offering documents, there are a lot of other documents that you may need to set up a regional center and or engage in EB-5. This is true whether you are setting up your own regional center and renting it out to others, or setting up your own regional center for your own project, or whether you're renting it out to other projects. So on this project, on this slide, you'll see a list of some of the documents that you're likely going to come across, or concepts you'll come across. Typically, the letter of intent is a big one because it helps guide the discussion. The loan agreement, or if it's an equity deal, sometimes an equity agreement, a stock purchase agreement is usually very important. And the guarantees and security agreements are important because investors are typically looking for some sort of collateral. Subordination is important if there's other financing or other players in the deal that may not want the EB-5 financing to be, pari passu or senior to them. And then, of course, the other big documents are any sponsorship agreements if you're renting out your regional center, if you're renting out someone else's regional center. And those are the key EB-5 documents, but everything you see on here on this slide is entered into commonly in EB-5.
That's the so-called memorandum of understanding between the regional center and the specific project. Is that it? The last one you referred to. Yep. So, when we get to file these applications, they tend to be, 10, 12 inches thick, and that's on the 526. And then when we file the 829, we're shipping out 10, 15 pounds of documents as the lawyer. But you're the guy who actually drafts most of these. So these are the critical securities offering documents that we see both in the 526 and in the 829 package to a lesser degree. You run through some of these quickly, Joel?
Yeah, sure. And this is, by the way, this list of documents is essentially true for every capital raise you do in the U.S. It doesn't have to be EB-5. So these are not requirements that EB-5 has imposed. These are requirements that U.S. law has imposed and that you need to adapt to EB-5. So of course, you're doing these things not just to get any EB-5 attorney, but an EB-5 attorney that knows how to do capital raises. And same thing, you don't just get any securities attorney. You have to get a securities attorney that understands EB-5. So can you jump back a slide?
Sure.
So these are the common documents. Investor questionnaire, just a questionnaire that sort of lets you kind of diligence preliminarily your investor to see if they're qualified. Subscription agreement, if they purchase the interest that you're trying to sell. The offering circular, or the PPM, is a disclosure document whereby you describe the offering and the risks involved in investing in the offering. And a limited partnership agreement, which is most oftenly used, or LLC operating agreement. And then sometimes the other corporate documents used, if those structures are used, typically in a smaller deal. That's the key document that explains the party's rights. And then the escrow agreement is usually reasonably important because EB-5 escrow is a unique animal. If you go to your regular escrow provider and try to get an EB-5 escrow done, it's going to take them half a year to figure out how to do it. So there's niche players in that space. It's typically requested by the investors, although there are some people that are able to get away without without having an escrow.
So explain to us the three stages that work in putting your securities docs.
Right. So basically, our firm, when we think about these projects as clients come to us, and only the securities part of it, we classify into 3 steps when they need some sort of version of securities documents. Now, you can apply for a regional center if you're going down the regional center route. And if you're applying for the regional center, you can apply just to have your regional center approved, or you can at the same time apply to have your regional center approved and an exemplar approved at the same time, so that when your regional center gets approved, you also have a project that is tentatively approved. So if you apply only for the regional center and you don't have a specific project that you're seeking approval for at that moment, there is the possibility of submitting a generic set of documents. It's still specialized, but it's generic in a sense that much of the specific language is ripped out, and we're providing a document or set of documents that is very short, very concise, says everything USCIS wants to see, doesn't say anything USCIS doesn't want to see, and it's going to get thrown away, but the purpose is for them to not ask questions on offering documents while they're reviewing your regional center application. Now, at the same time, if you wanted to, you could apply for exemplar set of documents, and for all intensive purposes, the exemplar set of documents, no material changes really should be made to it, but from that time that you submit it and it gets approved by USCIS and the time that you go to actually market and sell the securities, we treat those two roughly as the same, and that's essentially a full set of documents. And so essentially, you've got your exemplar and the actual offering are two different stages, but they have essentially the same document.
Joel, can you give us a primer on the basics of securities laws, just so we know where we should be going and what to watch for?
Yeah, certainly. We're going to go through this extremely fast. This webinar is the first one of a series of 4 webinars, and as we start getting into some of the other webinars, we'll go into these in more advanced concept. But generally, here are some hit points. EB-5 offerings generally involve securities. There are some cases where they might not, but in 98% of the time, it probably involves securities. And all you need to know is that securities are regulated. And how are they regulated? They basically say if you're going to sell securities, you have to register them, which is essentially almost like going IPO. Or you find an exemption, much cheaper, much faster, much less disclosure, much less headache. The 2 exemptions are most commonly used in EB-5 so that you wouldn't have to register your securities, or Reg B, which is thought of as the private offering. It's technically not a private offering, especially now that the Jobs Act has been passed. Not implemented yet, but passed, which makes it possible to do a public offering while still publicly soliciting. So next year, as the SEC comes down with final rules, it'll be interesting to see the impact on Reg B. Reg S is the other exemption, which basically says it's the U.S.'s way of saying, if you're going to do offshore offering, do everything offshore, only target offshore investors, we're going to leave it alone. And that's Reg S. Most deals you'll see, early deals in the U.S. that were EB-5 tended to be Reg B. A lot of people just didn't understand Reg S. And then once people started thinking, oh, we could use Reg S, a lot of deals started doing just being Reg S. I think ever since our firm really got into it, you're starting to see more and more firms that do combine Reg B and Reg S, just because our firm takes a position that anything could go wrong. So if the government is going to come sue you and say you didn't comply with Reg S, then we're going to make them prove that you didn't comply with Reg B as well.
Well, we received very good guidance from Michael Gibson regarding to broker-dealers. Fill us in on that. What are the securities elements and concerns in this arena, Jor?
Yeah, before I get into that, Michael Gibson and I combined to make a pretty lethal 1-2 punch in EB-5, and we're generally very good at scaring the heck out of people.
That's for sure. You've scared me enough times.
But in reality, EB-5 properly done is a great vehicle. The program on all ends is great. It helps immigrants, it helps the U.S. economy, it helps issuers, if it's not abused. I do have to emphasize that the SEC is definitely investigating. What I know for a fact, in addition to them calling Michael Gibson to ask for information, they've caught some of our clients, they've caught some investors to randomly just ask questions. I also know that USCIS has come out and admitted that SEC attorneys have been lent out to USCIS and are on staff with USCIS, and that USCIS is referring cases for enforcement to SEC. And separate from that, I have, for some reason I was at a firm where a lot of them, left the hard firm life and went and got a cushy government job at the SEC. So I've been in touch with them, and they've confirmed that the buzzing around the halls is that there is EB-5 investigation going on. So one of the areas of risk, of course, are broker-dealers versus finders. If you are going to solicit investors, participate in a securities offering, passing along the PPM, telling a friend, hey, here are the offering documents. I think it's not bad. Check it out. Or if you regularly do it, so even if you don't do that, but over the course of a year, you've sent 30 referrals over, or if you receive a compensation that's tied to success of the transaction, if so-and-so invests, I get X percent, you're going to be considered by the SEC to be a unlicensed broker-dealer. The courts are starting to challenge this. Specifically, the courts are starting to challenge whether alone the concept of receiving compensation based on success makes someone a broker-dealer, but there's not enough for us to hang our hat on right now. You have to take the assumption that even if you do nothing else, even if you don't regularly solicit investors, even if you don't regularly introduce investors, even if you don't take any part in the offering, if you're only saying, John meet Adam, Adam meet John, and then telling John, if Adam invests, I get some money, that fact alone to the SEC makes you an unlicensed broker-dealer. What are the penalties? Not to scare you, but especially in California, it means that if something goes wrong, the investor wants their money back, they can just ask for their money back, sue you for their money back, and you could personally be on the hook for that. It also means that you could be fined. You could also go to jail, theoretically. But, we all hope that if you're not Martha Stewart or you don't do something egregious, that they won't do that. But there are definitely risks to acting as an unlicensed broker-dealer.
Joel, you're scaring the hell out of me, but I'm glad you're doing it. We've heard it before, and the words of caution by Michael Gibson in this particular arena is very, very strong and clear, and Joel, you too have given us very clear guidelines. So there's a right way and a wrong way to approach this particular program, and obviously one's only going to go with the right and correct way to do it. So one of the things that you have to do, Jor, is in terms of preparing an application, whether it's a standalone project or whether it's a regional center, is you have to put a team together. Can you fill us in a little bit about some of the parts of this team?
Yeah, certainly. And before everyone gets scared off on their finder's fees, just know that many deals are done properly with broker-dealer fees being paid to, people that can receive broker-dealer fees legally, or they're being structured in ways where the broker-dealer issue doesn't come up. So definitely there are ways to do it right. With every, lawyers have a habit of scaring people, but really it's only to guide them toward the right direction. So with all of these things that you hear on today's conference, there is definitely a lot of, pitfalls, but that's why you have lawyers to help guide you so that you don't fall into them. With respect to the team, it's extremely important because this is the team that's going to help you not waste time. In every single deal that I have seen where someone has tried to figure it out themselves, and I'm not talking just the pieces that, our corporate law firm does, but when they try to do their own, EB-5 business plan, when they try to do their own EB-5 I-526 application, I-924 applications, in every single instance I've ever seen that, it has at best caused extra money and extra delay for the whoever was trying to get the green card or raise the money. And at worst, it's resulted in a denial, which means their project is essentially gone. So it's very important to get a team. You're going to need a business plan writer, and you'll need two business plans typically. A business plan that's a real business plan, and then you also need a business plan that's EB-5 customized that focuses on jobs. If you're counting indirect or induced jobs, you'll need a qualified economist. Securities and transaction documents and entity formation, our firm does that. You need a corporate or securities attorney for that. The financials projections, many people don't know how to put these together. So getting a qualified CFO type or CPA that has that experience to create pro formas is important. And the immigration, how did I leave the immigration attorney out of this? I'm sorry, Bernie. The immigration attorney...
We're going to get into trouble there, Joel, leaving the immigration lawyer out, but I was going to jump in, so don't worry.
The immigration attorney is typically the most important. I would say, if they weren't the most important, then maybe, the corporate, transactional folks were the next most important, because it's typically one of those two groups. It's either your immigration attorney or your corporate attorney that is going to probably project manage and run the deal for you and get all the other team members together in place. And of course, the marketing consultants, once everything is done, there's nothing more important than marketing, because if everything's done and you don't have someone like Brian Su and Artisan Business Group involved, it's hard to get investors.
Yeah, I was just going to say that marketing role is pretty much what Brian Su does, and is, in my opinion, the leading experts in this arena. Financial pro forma projections, the financial analysts, again, we had Michael Gibson, who does, quite frankly, more sophisticated work than simply reviewing the pro formas, and you, Jor, being one of the top securities folks. Look at that incredible, what do you mean you're only a rising star? I thought you were already a superstar, but I know that's only 2.5% of the winners. Jor, he's still young. That means you're under 40. Impressive. I'm the old guy who's been around doing this for some time, and thank you very much for saying that nice comment about the role of the immigration lawyer. Putting the team together, and I just want to qualify, I mean, there's other members of this team that you may need in terms of you may want an accountant, a CPA to manage all the various different transactions. You may need your website designer, part of the marketing to get the plan out there, get the program out there, and generally speaking, it is the immigration lawyer who acts as the sort of general manager or the quarterback for this. So if it involves setting up a regional center, for example, I have my team that I work with. I'm proud to say that Jor is one of the people that we like to work with. Michael is one of the financial folks. Brian is the expert in this area. We have our business plan folks. We have our economists that we like to work with, and we put together what we call a package team, so we can provide what we call one-step shopping when it comes to setting up a regional center and helping taking a project to market, as it were. So thank you very much, Jor, for your comments. Thank you, Brian Su. Thank you, Michael Gibson, for your input and guidance today. This has really been most helpful. We've been going for over an hour. I encourage any of you to use your chat function if you do have questions. We have very large audience today, over 150 people signed on, close to 160 people signed on today for today's program, so I hope you found this interesting. We are going to have our second EB-5 webinar on December the 13th. This was supposed to be a basic presentation, but quite frankly, we went into considerable depth in terms of marketing. We went into considerable depth on the financial analysis aspect in terms of evaluating projects, and that would be both regional center projects and individual standalone projects. And then, of course, we had Jor Law, one of the experts in the securities and corporate lawyer arena. The topics of discussion that we are going to go into in considerable depth on our next webinar on December the 13th, we're going to include a basic overview of the Regional Center program. We're going to discuss the standalone or direct investment projects where an individual puts $1 million and hires 10 people directly. That amount, by the way, can be reduced to $500,000 if the investment is in a targeted employment area defined as 150% unemployment ratio over the national average. So most of California, in fact, qualifies within that particular arena. And we'll define the differences. Of course, a rural area can also qualify. Excuse me, folks, just on the end of losing my voice. We'll also go into the timing flowchart, how this actually works, explaining from the beginning all the way through to the end of the program. Explain the market, who is actually interested in the regional center program. We will go into the advantages of regional center EB-5s, which is mainly the opportunity to use indirect job counts and induced direct and indirect employees, as well as induced employment counts. Investor due diligence, we spent a lot of time talking about that today. We'll examine some of those aspects in further detail. We've already covered this topic in considerable depth, the question of advising businesses on aspects of the process, advising on the business aspects of the process, I apologize, which is really not what immigration lawyers are qualified to do. Michael Gibson is certainly qualified to do that. We're going to go through the process of putting together the 526 based on the individual or standalone investments, and then of course the 526, which is the initial petition based on regional centers. We will comment on some of the hot button issues, job creation issues, bridge financing issues, some of the new tenant occupancy issues, guest expenditure issues, and then we will talk about the source of funds and the path of the source of funds. This, quite frankly, is the, let's call it the second most important aspect. You fundamentally have two parts to a 526 immigrant visa petition application, which is, number one, the source and path of funds to show the money was lawfully earned and to show the continuous chain from the time the money was earned or received, whether it was an inheritance or whether it came from a trust or whether it was a gift, or whether it was earned, and how that money from that point of being lawfully earned until the point where it goes directly into escrow or into the project, as the case may be. And then, of course, we will go into considerable depth on the 829 process, which is the application to remove the conditional nature of permanent residence. What are the issues that we're looking at? And then, as usual, we'll go into a question and answer framework. Folks, we've been going, we're actually beyond our scheduled time already. I'm just giving it a little bit of extra time. I don't know whether our chat function is working or not working today because we're not getting questions, and that's unusual because we normally do get lots and lots of questions, so I don't know if you've been trying to type in, but if you do have questions, please go ahead. We have lots and lots of questions. It's just me and the technology element not being able to access them. So why don't we go into the beginning and see if we can answer some of these questions. First question of the day. My cousin owns a biotech company in India and wants to immigrate with her husband and 2 children. They're distributors and buy biotech products from many countries and distribute all over India. They can show 1 million but prefer other ways to set up a business here and immigrate. Perhaps you can use this as an example in your presentation. Well, you know, what the person does abroad, you know, from an immigration perspective, one of the things that we do is we look at the complete picture. This particular individual who seems to have a substantial company in India, if they wanted to immigrate to the United States, there would be various options. If they were no longer interested in running a business, they were just interested in, for example, a passive investment, and as Jor Law explained, they could invest an amount of either $1 million or $500,000, if appropriately reduced, into a regional center, and because of either the limited partnership or the LLC, but preferably with the limited partnership, they're actually restricted from managing the day-to-day affairs. So if they really wanted to be passive, they could invest in a regional center project. We've discussed a few of them, put $500,000, show that it's lawfully earned, and then apply for a green card. We'll go into this in more depth, but Basically, processing time for this type of green card is going to take about a year and a half. We briefly mentioned the possibility that, or probability, that China will in fact have a backlog. This won't or should not affect Indian applicants. So I would, in this particular instance, look at the EB-5 program if they wanted to make a $500,000 investment in a regional center, or if they wanted to manage their own business, they could make $1 million or $500,000 if appropriately reduced, hire 10 employees, and in fact run their own commercial enterprise. However, if they set up their own branch office or affiliate of the existing entity, that may also qualify them for an EB-1, employment-based first preference, and maybe that isn't the program that we are in fact going to use. These, by the way, are all the slides that you're going to see in the next program. So I encourage you all to log on. There's our contact information for all 4 of our panelists today. Please do feel comfortable in going on to this particular program. So on to number 2 question. Can you explain equity deal versus debt deal? Does it mean that I loan the money to the project or become an equity partner? Yes, that is basically it. In some of the particular projects, when you invest, you acquire equity. You get a certain percentage of ownership of that particular LLP or LLC. And in the other framework that that was explained by, I believe it was Jor, what effectively happens is that the investors create a separate LLP that then loans money to the job-creating enterprise, and through that loan, you actually create the jobs. So moving on, do you need a team for both standalone as well as for the regional center? Yes, indeed. You do, in fact, need to have to put together a team of specialists. Obviously, in the standalone project, it's a little bit less complicated. It's also a whole lot faster. So in the standalone framework, you know, registering a regional center at the moment can take at least a year, plus the 2 or 3 months that it takes to get all the documentation together. So yes, you do need a team of specialists. I know this is self-serving, but I'm going to be self-serving anyway. Absolutely, yes, you go to an immigration lawyer to start with this, and we will help put the team together. You can also start with a corporate lawyer in some instances, and they can advise you on how to put the team together. So any one of the 3 of us, myself, Brian is somebody who can steer you towards appropriate parties, and Jor as well as of course, Michael. Is there any possibility for H-1B visa holders who are currently working in the United States to opt for this route? The answer is absolutely yes. Many H-1B holders, for example, if you come from India, the waiting line for a green card through the bachelor's degree category is close to 10 years, and with the master's degree category is 4 to 6 years. But if you were an Indian national on an H-1B, and you invested $500,000 in a regional center, you can in fact fast-track your green card and process your conditional green card within a year. So absolutely, people who are on H-1B, student visas, etc., can in fact use this program to obtain permanent resident status instead of going through the PERM process where you advertise a job and show that there's no qualified U.S. workers who can in fact do this. We're running close to 2 o'clock, which I'm going to arbitrarily make our deadline. But again, folks, our next program will be on December the 13th. I encourage you to register again, and then you will be able to put your questions to us, and we will make sure all of them are answered. You can, of course, reach us offline at the appropriate contact information. I have been told that children of investors who are over 21 years of age and unmarried have been stayed in the United States can be granted green card along with their parents. Is this true? Yes, 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 absolutely. If, in fact, children are under the age of 21, pretty much at the time of the application is made, there is a procedure to lock in, that is to lock in their age, this gets very complicated. It's called the Child Status Protection Act, CISPA, and effectively you can create a lock-in of the child's age at 21. Excuse me, folks. A lock-in of the child's age. You get to deduct the time that the petition was pending from the child's age, and then if you can get to what we call step 2, which is to adjust status or immigrant visa process while the kid's artificial age is in fact locked in, then in fact you can protect the kid. I'm not going to try and explain CISPA in this brief time other than to tell you that you really want to try and start when the kid's 19 or 18 even, but if the kid is still under 21, there may be a chance to in fact lock in. We just did a blog on the consequences of the Chinese projected Chinese retrogression, which will impact this for many kids who are about 20, 21. So there's going to be a lot of I'm not going to call the word problems yet, but at least issues for those kids who in fact age out because of the potential backlog. I'm going to take the last question of the day. Let's say I'm currently in the U.S. under OPT and start applying for EB-5. Am I allowed to remain in the U.S. if my OPT status expires in the next 6 months or less? So here's the critical point. If you only have 6 months left on your OPT, you're potentially going to run into some timing issues. In your particular case, you probably want more than 6 months, and the reason being is that most 526 applications are taking 6 to 8 months to get adjudicated. Of course, some are flying through in as little as 3 or 4 months, but you need to have a strategy because 6 months is a little bit sketchy, as it were. There's a possibility that your OPT will expire, actually a probability that your OPT will expire before the 526 petition is approved, and that means you would have to try and flip over to an H-1B, possibly try and flip back to an F-1, complete your studies, or possibly have to go back to your home country in order to pick up your green card. So that's the type of strategic advice that we give as immigration lawyers, and my tech specialist is reminding me that we are currently at 2 o'clock, which is our deadline for today. I hope you've all enjoyed our program, found it informative. We have had the leading experts in the area. We will have our next one in 2 weeks. Please spread the good word, and we'll all be talking again on December the 13th, where we will go into additional depth on these. You can go to our website, www.wolfsdorf.com, to get more information and register for our next webinar. So thank you all for participating. It's been a pleasure, and with close to 160 folks signed up for today's program, I'd say this is an enormous success, and we look forward to 250 to 300 participants on the next one. Bring your questions. We should be able to get most of them answered, and it's been an absolute pleasure sharing this hour or two with you. And until next time, farewell, and let's all become EB-5 immigration experts. Thank you again, and goodbye.